Hello and welcome to the International Women's Day virtual conference and today's webinar, Quotas, a Blessing or a Curse. My name is David Kelly and I'm the Executive Director of the British Chamber of Commerce here in Singapore. Whilst the coronavirus has changed our plans to hold our annual International Women's Day lunch, important discussions around gender equality continue, and this year we bring you a very special triple session International Women's Day virtual conference in its place, and we hope that by continuing to think together, we can help accelerate the pace of gender balance in organisations and together find a way forward. We began the series within this conference last week on Tuesday with a really interactive webinar where we heard the latest insights and trends from Mercer's When Women Thrive research. On Thursday last week, keynote speaker and former London Fire Commissioner Danny Cotton shared her experience of working in a male-dominated environment and the development that she had seen over the past 31 years in the force. Today, we see the final webinar of our conference and one which will no doubt create an interesting debate over the question of quotas in the workplace. Are they a blessing or a curse? This fantastic conference would not have been possible without the support of our Women in Business Committee, who work extremely hard to keep these important topics at the forefront of our minds within the Chamber. Another huge thank you to Barclays Bank, our diversity and inclusion partners who support all of our activity that we deliver in this space. I would now like to introduce you to Alex Harrison, Singapore Country Manager and Head of Corporate Banking Asia Pacific and Middle East at Barclays Bank, and also the co-chair of our Diversity and Inclusion Business Committee, to say a few words. Alex will be followed by a short video featuring the work Barclays are doing to support the D&I agenda. Over to you, Alex.
Thank you, David. As David already mentioned, my name is Alex Harrison. I'm Country Manager for Barclays in Singapore alongside my Head of Corporate Banking for APAC and the Middle East. I also have the distinct pleasure as well as being the co-chair for the British Chamber's D&I Committee, as well as the regional co-chair for Barclays Women's Network across APAC. It's with great honour that I have the opportunity to open up this session for the series of IWD events that are being delivered virtually by BritCham. I think the panel today will be covering a really challenging topic and I look forward to hearing their opinions, views and perspectives. Wherever we are on our respective D&I journeys, whether that's as individuals or as corporate entities, we must recognise that it is a journey and that whilst progress has been made in gender equality, there is far more road ahead of us than behind. Therefore, I'm very grateful that Barclays has the opportunity to support BritCham's events, which is openly discussing and debating such important subject matter. It helps us to progress our agenda with pace. D&I is deeply rooted within Barclays' DNA. We are strongly supportive and an advocate of D&I across the bank. We actually have 6 D&I employment network groups who drive their respective agendas, but also work in collaboration to focus on the intersectionality of D&I, creating a workplace that is inclusive for all colleagues and an equal and fair environment at work and beyond. We also feel that collaboration is key externally and believe that the power of our collective collaboration across sector, industries and geographies is critical in ensuring we accelerate not only the gender equality issues, but equally as well a D&I agenda that is fully transparent and fair and just for all. To bring that collaboration to life, we would now like to play a short video for you, which highlights Barclays' partnership with the House of Lords in London, UK. I would like to thank you for your time today and thank David for the kind introduction. And I hope you're looking forward to today's event just as much as I am. Thank you.
Inclusivity means finding out what makes each person special.
It's about everybody being in the room, be it male, be it female, have an equal say.
Organisations can absolutely change behaviours, change attitudes, change assumptions about what people can and can't do in the workplace.
Parliament as a place of work should represent the gold standard in terms of gender inclusive policies. When we're passing legislation, we have the moral platform to say to them, we live these values ourselves.
Don't feel like you should be shut out and use your voice. Trust in its power.
We will know that we have an inclusive environment within Barclays from a gender equality perspective when we see more females within leadership positions and actually see our male colleagues and leaders role modelling inclusive leadership more visibly.
What's in the way of gender equality? I think it's history, it's perception, it's assumptions that people make about other people and what they can do and what they can bring to an organisation.
I feel like I owe it to people who still experience discrimination in the workplace to use my platform, to use my voice, to shout loud for gender equality.
We need to get more men in the conversation. We have to move the agenda forward. And to do that, we've got to engage all colleagues, and it starts from the top.
One of my colleagues was very fearful of telling me that she was pregnant because she had been newly promoted into the role, and she thought that my perception of her would change. So I had to reassure her that, look, firstly, congratulations. Is there anything I can do to help? I actually saw a spike in her performance because she felt she didn't have to worry about her job.
I think we've done some fantastic work, and we've made a lot of progress from where we used to be 10, 20 years ago, where women were still a rarity in staff at all. We do now have senior women, and we have inclusive working practices such as job shares, proper maternity leave and support for working mothers. But there's still a way to go.
I think the question of how people can be part of change is always a difficult one, because it really begins with accepting that you actually have a role to play. And by taking the conscious decision that you are going to make a difference, you are helping. No matter how small you may feel your contribution is, it does mean something to someone somewhere.
10 years ago, I was the only black female on the management board. Now, I am still the only black female on the management board. There's still a heck of a lot more for us to do, and for us not to become complacent in what we've achieved.
And one of the things that really concerns me is what I think is quite a dangerous narrative of the job is done, the battle has been fought and won.
Traditionally, we have seen leaders hiring in their own mirror image. What we want to now see is leaders actually embracing groups of individuals who are not from similar backgrounds, and make sure that we do truly have diversity and an inclusive environment.
Inclusion means to me everybody is somebody. Everyone has something to give. We need to find ways of finding what that something is. Not to presume, not to label anyone, but just be very curious and find out what makes you, you.
Believe in the power of your own voice, champion the causes of those around you, acknowledge your own privilege to begin with, and think about how you can use the benefits that you have in your workplace to empower people who maybe don't have them.
It is exciting that we are talking about it, and we are effecting the change in society that we want to see. And it is collective. It is no longer just about women talking about it. We've got the male allies, which we celebrate, but collectively together.
Thank you so much indeed, Alex, and to Barclays Bank once again. So turning to today's session, as we go through today's presentation, please use the Q&A facility on the Zoom toolbar at the bottom of your screen. Our panel will try and address as many of the questions that you put through following their presentations. I'm now absolutely delighted to introduce you to our moderator for today, Lewis Garrard, Principal and Business Lead, People Science Growth Markets at Mercer. In his role, he applies his training in the organizational psychology and experience in the development of data-driven talent, engagement and employee performance programs to help business leaders and HR executives design people practices to improve organizational performance. Lewis, really looking forward to this session, and over to you.
Thanks so much, David. And, you know, it's a real pleasure to be able to be here with everyone today. So look, there's lots of ways to talk about inequities and inequalities in life. You know, we at Mercer very often are talking about the differences in compensation that women and men have when they progress in their careers. But today, I think we're really going to be focused on a different kind of inequity or outcome, which is it's about opportunities. So this is a conversation about representation and the opportunities that people get. I think we all have our favorite statistics about representation. My favorite one is that as of about 2016, if you look at the Fortune 500, there were more chief executives called Dave than there were women chief executives within that group of companies. And Dave isn't even the most common name for chief executives in that group. It's actually John. So, you know, there's a lot of evidence around us that, you know, women are not perhaps receiving the opportunities that they deserve. Indeed, you know, if we look at educational achievement, we can see that women and young girls coming out of school are equaling or doing better than men in many cases. And indeed, there's really no evidence that of a lack of ambition or interest in taking more senior leadership positions, or, you know, for women to really take a more stronger leadership role, particularly if they believe that they will be competent and actually good within that position. So this is why we often talk a lot about bias. You know, what is it that leads us to perhaps you know, create systems that mean women are not getting the opportunities that they deserve? You know, we talk about negative forms of bias, discrimination, you know, just leaving people out, and positive forms of bias where we, you know, do favors for our friends or people who are like us. But less discussed is perhaps a more pervasive, but less innocuous, or a more innocuous form of bias, which is a bias towards the status quo. You know, we use the sort of world around us, particularly when we're making complex decisions. We sort of look to see what usually happens, what are others doing. You know, we use these signals to get a sense of what should happen, and very often this gets in the way of us making real change. And that's why I think it's important for us to be talking about quotas today. So we're going to have a little bit of audience interaction. Let's start with a poll, and then I'll share a little bit of social science with you. That's my background. But Helen, if you could bring up the first poll, we'd really like to see your point of view on quotas. You know, it's an easy question, but do you believe in setting hard quotas in order to improve female representation in leadership roles? What's your perspective? And you know, this is a topic that I think has really been debated to death almost. You know, we've seen some countries and businesses really adopting quotas. You know, that's the way that they want to drive outcomes, you know, set targets. Others have been much more reluctant. So let's see what you feel as an audience. So super interesting. Just 50-50 basically is what we're looking at here. Just 53% of you said yes, that you do believe in quotas to improve representation on leadership roles, and just under 50%, 47% of you said no. So let's see whether or not you change your mind through the course of this. So one of the things I want to share with you about bias towards the status quo is just a quick study, actually, that was published in the Harvard Business Review. Helen, if you could pull that up for the audience here, and we'll just kind of use this as a bit of an introduction. So one of the things that I think is really interesting, if you think about you know, candidate pools, and when we look, you know, at people having opportunities, when we look at that data and start to look at, so who gets selected, who actually gets hired, when we look at different candidate pools, one of the things that the social science tells us is that minorities actually are usually given fewer opportunities than dominant groups. And what's really interesting here is that if you can see the data on the left-hand side, when you have, in this particular context, genders equally represented, or indeed when women are overrepresented within the group, the outcomes tend to be more fair, more driven by you know, equal proportions. So the person getting the job is equally likely to be selected as a man, for example, if there are 50-50 representation. But if the person is a minority, if there's only, for example, one woman in the pool of 4, she almost has a statistically 0% chance of being selected. And part of the reason is that this is a bias towards the status quo. It highlights how different she is from the norm. You know, it's telling us that within this particular talent pool, it's more the talent pool is more likely to be male. And so, you know, when we're trying to make complex decisions, we tend to err on the side of what the sort of dominant the demographic within the talent pool is. And so, you know, there are these, this isn't bias in the sense that each one of us are being discriminatory or selecting in favorites. Very often it's just the signals that we're using from the data that we have in front of us. So this is a meaningful and important topic for us to be discussing. And what I'd love to do now is start to invite each of the wonderful panelists we have with us to kind of share their point of view. Oh, by the way, before I move on there, sorry, Helen, there's a QR code in the top of that slide. If you'd like to read that article, then you can snap it now. I'm sure many of us are used to sort of grabbing these QR codes as we move around Singapore these days. But if you'd really like to read up on this study and find out more about it, it's a super interesting paper, then I think you would benefit a lot from that. So a little bit of follow-up reading from us there. All right, so let's get on to our panelists. We're here to hear from them. What we're going to do is just give them 10 minutes to sort of introduce themselves and their point of view on this topic. We've had a couple of warm-up sessions, and we know we have a diverse point of view on the panel that we have joining us today. So really excited to hear from them. So the first person I'd like to introduce to you is Lo Peck. Peck is a senior civil servant. She is basically the Chief Human Resource Officer for the government in Singapore. She can tell you more about herself, but we're super happy and excited to have her here. And Peck, I'd like to invite you to share some of your experiences and thoughts on this topic. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Louis. Good afternoon, everyone. Well, on top of being a Chief HR officer for the Singapore government, I also happen to be the president or elected president for the Singapore Human Resource Institute in Singapore. So thank you for having me, and I'm very pleased to be on the panel with my esteemed panelists. And just as a background, and also to answer the question of that Louis said, of my point of view of whether quota does it work, and is it a curse or is it a blessing? Well, I personally don't really think quota works. Would it actually increase representation for women in boards or in senior leadership positions? Well, I think that answer would be yes. Then the next question is really, will it give us the outcome that we want by having more women representation and to get that diversity of views and all that? Maybe, maybe not. And is that the best way? Well, probably not. And it's interesting to see the results of the poll where, more than half actually says that, yeah, it will be a good idea to set quota. And slightly less than half actually don't agree. So yeah, I'm in the minority group. So I actually grew up in an environment where kind of quite surrounded by men. So I graduated as an engineer in electrical and electronics. In fact, I did power and control. So this was wonderful during that time because there are very few women who choose to take up engineering. And what it means is that when I have a class of 40 engineering undergraduates, about 5 of us are women. So you have a lot of guys to choose from. In fact, that's where I found my spouse, happily married for the last 36 years. So apart from, growing up in the engineering environment which is pretty much male dominated, when I went into the private sector, I actually joined MNCs and in the disk drive industry. And because it is the technical or technology field, there are also quite biased towards the senior leadership positions tend to be men, and the production operators or the blue-collared ones tend to be a lot more women. So I think as we look at setting quota, it's not just blindly setting a quota, but really in like board representation and in senior leadership positions. And I firmly believe in including women into some of these boards and senior positions, mainly because we are just different. And there are things which a woman is able to give their point of view, which the guys don't get it, okay? So eventually when I joined Hewlett-Packard, and this is one company who really value diversity and inclusion, but it is done really, especially in countries like Singapore. I think we value meritocracy a lot. So it is really, you know, making sure that, I think as Lewis's survey or research shows, when you have a panel that is interviewing, make sure the interviewing panel has the right composition. So you give people the right chance and the right opportunity. And I think that is important. And as a senior leader who is a woman, and I have worked in a European company, or I worked in an NGO called the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition. And when I was selected into that position that is based in Geneva, one of the key reasons why I was selected, because this is an organization or an NGO that is based in Geneva, and the composition of the senior team, they are mainly white males, and the idea of bringing me in as a senior director with Asian woman, these are things which the board loves, the level of diversity that I bring. And during the interview, I was told, yeah, you will bring that level of diversity, which is very helpful. And if you ask me at a point in time, oh, do you feel bad that, you know, you were hired into that job just because you are a woman or because you are Asian? I would say no, because the starting point of it is that I was brought in because they value the diverse viewpoints that I bring in. And because I'm a woman and because I'm Asian, I bring certain viewpoints which they don't already have. So it kind of complements the team very much. And I'm one of the rare breed that joined the Singapore Public Service at a senior level. And the Singapore Public Service tend to promote people from within, and not very often we will kind of being able to bring in a person from the private sector and integrate well. And because I know that the reason why I'm brought into the public sector is because I bring that outside in perspective. And I think, you know, if we set a quota, but more importantly, the process at which we do it, and giving people the reason why you need that diversity, I think that is more important. So that's my point of view. Back to you, Lewis.
Thank you, Peck. Amazing. Just I want to say that you've demonstrated your technical competence here by being able to get the wonderful background working. So yes, your engineering background serving you well. Just one quick question for you before we move on to Naveen. I mean, you mentioned there just how meritocratic Singapore is as a society, and you know, it seems that that's really influenced your development, your thinking. Is there any room for quotas within a society that values meritocracy like Singapore does, or is it patently unmeritocratic to be saying that, well, we just need to fill up these numbers? What's your view on that?
I think we do have some wiggle room. Okay, even though we say, you know, it's mainly a meritocratic society, and like we all know, if you compose an interview panel with a majority which is not for inclusivity, then it is quite difficult for the organization to bring in that diverse views. So sometimes I think it's a balance. And as a HR practitioner, I would say that, you know, sometimes it's a balance, and you need to know when you need to tweak, and you need to know when you actually need to set a quota.
Sure.
So even back when I was in HP, we were quite clear that, for new hires, you can only hire 40% that are fresh graduates. The others, you have to hire from the open market. So that actually helps us ensure that there is the right composition of diversity into the organization.
Fair enough. All right. Well, thank you very much. Well, with that, wonderful to hear your point of view. We're going to move on to introduce the wonderful Naveen Menon from Cisco. Super excited. This is our tech exec on the panel here, appropriately dressed as we were commenting beforehand. So Naveen, over to you to sort of introduce yourself. I know you've got some really interesting sort of mini poll results to share with us. We're excited to hear those. So over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Lewis. And, I just wanted to say this is such a fascinating topic and so many different points of view from different people. And I'm hoping we'll get a lot of questions at the end as well, because the real power in these kind of webinars and these kind of discussions is the discussion itself. So, anyway, I'll come to that in just a second as well, because I wanted to talk about the first poll that just came out. Just a little bit about myself. So I grew up in the Netherlands. I was born in India, but I grew up in the Netherlands and spent most of my life in Europe before moving to Asia in 2006. I am married and I have three boys. So we're a fairly male-dominated household, which is usually good for me. Not great for my wife, but look, that's the situation we have right now at home. But I have to say, I grew up with a very strong set of female role models. From my mother to my wife to my mother-in-law, very, very strong advocates of how change can be driven from, in policy, in life, in education, in healthcare. Very, very strong advocates for driving change in every part of society. This has been my life and my influence up to this day. So I have very, very strong female role models in my life. I did a bit of work on gender topics and inclusion when I was in consulting. I spent 18 years in consulting before joining Cisco about 3 years ago. And I did a lot of work in the telecoms industry. And we did look heavily at why there was such an overly biased male-dominated industry in the telecoms industry. And I also looked at the consulting industry itself, and that was very male-dominated as well. And the numbers obviously are something consultants are very good at, but it didn't really lead to much change. And I love the video because it shows that, there was a woman on the video earlier who said, I was the only black board member, female board member, and I'm still the only black female board member 10 years later. So it's great to kind of highlight numbers, but on the other hand, there's very little action that seems to have come out in the last 10 years. And in my current role, I have very, very strong gender diversity and female leadership who are at Cisco. So for example, my boss who runs Asia Pacific, Japan and China is a woman. She's a Japanese woman educated in the UK. So she looks Japanese, but she was educated in Oxford. So, she's got very, very posh English accent. Amazing woman, really fantastic leader. And she works for a woman that's the global head of sales, Jerry Elliott, who's based in the US. And we have certainly more than 50%, I think roughly 50% of our executive leadership team at Cisco are women, which is an anomaly, I think, in the technology sector. So when I look at ASEAN, we have about 55% of participation of women in the workforce, which is fairly good. China has slightly higher at about 61%. The world average is just below 50. India is hovering at about 25 to 28% participation of women in the workforce. So I thought, to answer the question on quotas, I'm not sure whether my perspective makes a lot of sense to hear, but I was actually more keen on hearing from the many women that I work with on a day-to-day basis, many of whom are board members in their own right on some of the key topics. So I actually asked them 7 questions, and I want to just tell you what those questions were and give you some of those answers, because that to me informed me a lot about the topic. So on the first question, Lewis, do you believe in setting hard quotas to improve female representation on boards? it was interesting to see the panelist, the answer in the poll gave about 50, it was kind of split, 53% for and 47% that said no. For all the 15 women that I polled, who are all board members, senior leadership team in publicly listed companies, 100% of them said yes, that they believe in setting hard quotas to improve female representation on boards. The second question I asked was, would appointing women onto boards by setting quotas be an efficient way to increase board effectiveness? To which all of them said yes. So having a quota system and appointing women through a quota system onto boards would increase the board effectiveness. Now, this is where the third question made me think a little bit. The third question was, would setting quotas lead people to be chosen for their diversity as opposed to their talent? And again, here, all of them said yes. So there's clearly a trade-off here in that, you know, the women who I polled said, yes, it's an efficient way to increase effectiveness on a board. But on the other hand, all 15 women said that the quotas would lead the board to choose candidates based on diversity as opposed to talent, which I thought was contradictory in terms, but an interesting point to explore maybe in the Q&A. And then the fourth question I asked was around, do businesses spend enough time creating processes or systems to integrate women onto the boards? And to which the answer was no, they don't spend enough time creating those processes to integrate women onto boards. And then regardless of having quota systems, I asked, would having more women on corporate boards lead to more female representation in the executive leadership teams? And they all said yes, that they believed that having more women on boards would allow for more inclusion and better representation of women in the executive leadership team. So I did get some comments, Lewis, from people saying, from the women who I polled, to say that it was important to make sure that the role of the chair of the board is very important in driving the right dynamic with the board to make sure that all members participate. I think it seems like there are many women who are the only female member on the board and feel that their contribution is not included or is not taken into account. And therefore it is the responsibility of the chair, according to my poll, all the women said to me that it was responsibility falls on the chair of the board to make sure that happens, and that there would be enough rigorous screening at the time of recruitment to make sure that the right females were being pursued for those board roles, and that the boards were open to more first-time board candidates to allow for more breakthrough of diverse talent, as opposed to choosing women who have been on boards, 4 or 5 times in the past. So the women who I spoke to said, we would like to see boards more open to first-time board candidates. And then when I asked about the risks in implementing gender-based quotas, there were some very interesting points that came out there as well. So there was one risk which was highlighted, which said that there is sometimes resentment and suspicion that the female board member only got her role due to the gender diversity quota. Some of the risks that they mentioned also is that at the end of the day, it's a question of balance, perspective, and timing. So quotas are often necessary to break down years of unconscious bias, to normalize diversity and break down the resistance, but hopefully over time, we wouldn't need quotas. So in the end, I guess the answers were all fairly consistent. And my view was, if you ask me now, what is my view? My view is I believe we need quotas, and we need these quotas at every level of the organization, not just at the board, but also at every level. And every organization tends to have a grading system or a role definition. So we should look across the roles and go, at every level, is there a structural imbalance? If there is, say, 85% men, 15% women at a certain level, we should introduce quotas. However, we should be able to discontinue those quotas when there is equality at that level. And that's where the challenge is. So right. Keen to hear more from the Q&A as well.
Yes, really good. So just a quick question before we move on to Veronica and hear her point of view, because it's great that you've leveraged your own experiences and of course the experiences of others, and it's really interesting to hear that point of view about is this a trade-off? If we create quotas, are we sort of saying, well, that will mean that we are bringing people who have less experience into this group by necessity. I mean, I'm curious, why don't we worry about that with men? You know, by definition, you know, there's going to be a pool of men who are not very good at this. They just, so what's getting in the way there? Why do we worry about this with women and not with men?
It's a great question, and I have absolutely no idea. Honestly, like I personally, I don't think I've ever been ready for any role that I've taken on, but it didn't stop me from trying for that role. I have no idea why we worry about this problem with women. I mean, I think we should ask some of the women on the group as well.
Yeah, very good. Yes, because so, you know, now we'll hand over to Veronica, but I think it's very interesting that, you know, part of the challenge here is sort of convincing everybody that, you know, the way that we express our competence is sometimes very different, and that doesn't mean you won't be very effective once you get into the role. It just seems a man is much more likely to say, yeah, I'll figure it out when I'm doing it. So really interesting. All right, well, thanks, Naveen. Great to hear from you. Now on to our last panelist, who's going to share some thoughts all the way from a wonderful spot in the UK. So Veronica, it's so wonderful for you to be able to join us from a very cozy spot there in Cornwall. Thanks very much. And over to you, and I'm really excited to hear about some of the work that you've been doing. I know lots of research and some great conversations from there in the UK. So over to you.
Thank you. So good morning, everyone. My name's Veronica Hope-Hailey. Some of you might have heard me speak in Singapore before. I've been there quite a lot and done a lot of external speaking. I'm a leadership expert. I'm an academic. I'm one of the university vice presidents at the University of Bath. I was Dean of the Business School for 7 years. I've worked at Cambridge, I've been at London Business School, I've been a professor at Cranfield, and so some of you may have come across me in that respect. In terms of the topic today, I've held 4 non-exec director posts, currently holding 2. I've just stepped down as chair of one of the largest British NGOs. I've chaired nominations committees. I think we haven't mentioned that yet. Chair of the nominations committee is a very important board role, and I've done that for 5 years. And I'm always in a minority. On all those boards, every single one of them, I'm in a minority. I sit on the university executive at Bath. I've sat on it for 7 years. And yes, I'm always in a minority. My background obviously is business school. Bath is a technological university. It's dominated, like NTU, by engineering, science, and business. And it tends to be a very male-dominated environment. I'm also going to add in a little bit about my personal life and why I feel so passionate about this. I have 5 daughters. I'm married and I have 5 daughters, and they're all in the workforce now. And one of my great missions is to make it possible for my highly talented daughters to have less of a struggle getting to the top of organisations or onto boards than perhaps I've experienced and my generation of women have experienced over the years. I came into the workforce when the very first set of equal opportunities legislation was being passed in the UK, and I never ever dreamt when I entered the workforce that we would be sitting decades later with the situation that we have, with such low representation of women in senior management positions and also on boards. So that's my great passion for this subject. I think progress has been poor, and I think we have to understand whether quotas is the solution or the only solution. I don't believe this is a binary question. I don't believe it's quotas or it's not quotas. I think it's much more complex than that. Let's just understand what's been achieved, at least in the UK. The Hampton-Alexander Review reported earlier this year, pre-COVID, that women hold 1/3 of board positions in UK's top companies, and that's a year ahead of the target that was set. So there was a lot of congratulations there. However, the second aim of the Hampton-Alexander Review was to have 33% of women in leadership teams in the firms listed in the London Stock Exchange FTSE 100 and FTSE 250. And we're a long way behind that second target. In fact, they estimated that 50% of all FTSE posts would have to go to women this year in order to meet that target. And that's clearly not going to happen, and we've had COVID along the way. Men are still 7 times more likely to be finance directors than women. And here we start to hit the problem. The problem is the pipeline. Not all men make it to board positions, because being a board director, as I will tell you, is actually very different from being an executive director. To be a non-executive director requires very, very different skills. To be an executive director requires different skills. So if you're going to get more women onto boards, you're going to have to widen this talent pool, because lots of men aren't suitable. And if you've got very, very few women in the talent pool anyway, some of those may not be suitable. That's one of the problems. The problem is the pipeline. The problem is what happens to women before they get to these senior management posts, and why they don't get the experience they need that will then naturally push them into these board positions. And that pipeline, as all the panelists and the moderator have talked about this morning, they've all talked about their personal backgrounds. That pipeline is created, yes, by what employers do and what the HR and the chief HR officer does, but it's also created by governments in terms of, certainly in Western Europe, what happens with childcare subsidies, how easy it is for women to actually stay in the workforce once they've had children. And it's very much affected by family attitudes and what encouragement you're given within your family, and also your access to higher education. So again, like Lewis, I can let you have lots and lots of references to very easily accessible research on all of this. We do also know from the research that it's absolutely proven that diversity on boards produces better decision making. Women are also, interestingly, proven to be much more ethical and considered in their decision making, and that makes them also extremely suitable for boards. And we also know that the research shows us that women as leaders take in much more broader considerations and are much more concerned about multiple stakeholders in their decision making. And all of these things make them incredibly suitable for boards. We also know from the research that for women, in terms of motivation and ambition, it's very, very important, if you're high talent and you're a woman, to see a woman on the board. That is motivational for you to go further, but also to actually stay with that employer. So one of the problems for employers going forwards, if you don't get women into these senior executive positions and on the boards, and they're high talent, they're likely to walk. So this is a commercial problem as much as anything else. And I think you will increasingly get purchasers, customers, contractors, funders asking about this diversity piece. I think there is going to be more monitoring, and there will be, certainly in Western Europe, there will be governments who choose, for instance, maybe not to work with certain universities because they haven't got enough representation. The research on quotas shows that quotas can affect women's self-image. So actually, if you're put onto a board as a result of a quota, the woman's image of them herself and their perception of their competence and ability and their right to be there can be affected. It can also, if they've not been naturally selected by the other board members, the research shows it can create in-groups and out-groups. And so there are difficulties, and the research shows this with quotas. And so for me, I'm slightly with Naveen here, is that I actually think we need quotas at other levels. It's not just about the boards. It's actually about ensuring that there is a suitability of a talent pool created at these lower levels, which then mean that women will make it to the boards on their own merit. And that's the important thing. I will just say one other thing though. I've always been against quotas up till now. But maybe it's just the level I'm at, the age I'm at now. I am with Naveen is that actually, if the quotas at other levels do not generate enough women in the board, I think there is some symbolism now for actual quotas being used to force boards to take women on because of this. After decades of battling as a minority in all my workplaces, on all the boards, I will tell you that for anyone who is in a minority, the extra emotional and physical effort you have to put in to getting there is extremely tedious, and for some in a minority is extremely off-putting. And the difficulty is, if we continue to make this difficult, if it is such a battle for women or other groups that are in a minority, people will eventually just give up, because it is a battle to get there for so many of us. And therefore, I find myself in a really difficult situation. I don't like quotas, but I am disappointed at our progress without them. And I think the answer lies in quotas at other levels in the organisations. Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Veronica. I mean, clearly depth of experience there. And, you've got some immediate questions. So I thought I might just pose one to you before we begin with the rest of the conversation. But, you shared 5 daughters. I mean, incredible. And, people are interested. So what advice have you given them, considering, your experiences here? That someone's asking, how did you bring them up? Given that, you personally have felt like an underrepresented minority, at various points of your career. 2 or 3 things that you would offer?
What, just how did I manage to have a really large family?
No, we know how that happened. We want to know. we want to know what advice you would give your daughters.
Well, the advice that I give my daughters is that, well, first of all, I instill them with a huge amount of confidence. And I say that there is no reason why they should not achieve. But I also make it very clear that what I've achieved has been the result of a lot of hard work. And they've seen that, and that hasn't done them any harm. And they are very, very aware of the amount of work that their mothers had to put in. And my advice to them is to just believe in themselves and to choose their partners very carefully, I would say, Lewis. I think one of the key things is having a partner that is actually supportive of a woman achieving and has an ego that is actually willing to see somebody go further perhaps than themselves. And I've been lucky enough to have a husband who is like that. He's an academic himself, he's a professor, but he has always been 100% behind me achieving. And I think those girls have also seen that.
Yeah, that's a wonderful answer. And, I notice also with the passing of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, some comments about Marty Ginsburg's role in her life. I mean, she vastly surpassed him in terms of her legal career, but just the stories about them are quite warming. And, you start to see the importance of that partnership for some people becoming sort of a very interesting set of stories.
Yeah, there is a Ruth Bader Ginsburg quote that I use. I do have a presentation on my career, which I've given around the world, and I do use one of her quotes, which is, "Can anyone have it or everything all the time?" And I do believe that what Ruth Bader Ginsburg said is true of my life. I think if you want a family and you want to achieve a leadership role, it is about sequencing, that there are some times when the family needs care, and there's some times where you put your foot on the career pedal. And the idea that you can do all of this simultaneously is something I counsel young women against, because burnout gets no one anywhere.
Fair enough.
So
I think you've given two really wonderful answers there. So before we begin the rest of this, you've heard now a little bit from me, but more importantly, some really wonderful positioning statements from our panelists. We've got a couple of other polls that we'd like, to share with the audience and just see where you're at. So let's start with this. What are the biggest barriers to using quotas? Some options here. The people who are already in leadership positions don't understand why they're needed. They're unfair to talented men who might miss out on more senior roles due to quotas. They cause women to doubt if they've been selected for their talent. They put pressure on organizations to promote women who are not ready to be leaders. They signal to women that they do not have enough talent to get ahead on their own merit. They do not address the underlying problem, which leads to underrepresentation in the first place. Or there are no barriers. This is a silly question. I'm open to that one too. I'd love to sort of get your views. What about the panel? If this is multiple choice, so choose as many you think is relevant. I mean, any of these really stand out? I think, Naveen, maybe some of your questions.
Yeah.
Stands out here.
Yeah, the one that stands out to me is it doesn't address the underlying problem, which leads to, I don't want to bias people when they're clicking though, that's the problem. But anyway, that stands out. I definitely rate that one highly. And then I think that the third one, the one that is about, they cause women to doubt if they've been selected for their talent. That came up consistently anyway in my interviews with the various women who are on boards right now. Even though they are incredibly strong leaders, they still end up somehow wondering, am I there because of a diversity statistic? Which is unfair and horrendous, but that's the downside of having the quotas to me. So that's a barrier. And that would be a legitimate barrier. It would be one that the board might say, hey, we shouldn't do quotas for that reason.
Yeah. What about you, Peck? Which of those really stood out for you?
I think for me, it's that that talented men feel that they are being unfairly treated unfairly because the quota issue, and I take offense to think that there are no talented women. Come on. It's always a balance, and like I said, if an organization should decide to set a quota, and even like I said in the university, if we leave it to purely free market, and you have a lot more guys who apply to study engineering, and very few women. So back to Veronica's point of the pipeline is just not there. And if you just say, I just take an equal amount, and they're probably equally talented, okay? And if the university does not make a conscious effort to say that, I need to make sure I set a percentage that I will bring in women engineers, I think, they will probably end up with a lopsided cohort.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, I was curious because, we've seen, certainly during the pandemic, some amazing examples of women in leadership positions. I'm always enamored with Angela Merkel as a, incredible example of a very effective leader who's never in the press for anything other than just made good decision. But you see, the problem then is that I guess you have a selection bias, which is that you know, only women are that exceptional make it to that level of leadership. And, you know, you can find times that by 100 as many other leaders who, you know, male leaders, frankly, who are doing a terrible job. And so you get this kind of selection bias, is that they have to be so good to get ahead that, you know, when you sort of finally look at the talent pool, there, you know, a lot of minority leaders are really exceptional because they had so many barriers to jump over.
Yeah, as you were talking about, you know, women political leaders in times of COVID, the one with women political leaders or prime ministers, those countries do very well.
Yeah.
Taiwan, New Zealand, you know. So I think back to Veronica's point of, you know, women just have that innate, they are a bit more considered, and they look at certain aspects which men probably don't. And a lot of HR practitioners are women. So I think especially during the COVID period, it is really balancing between empathy and economic.
Right.
So
yeah. So we got the poll results popped up here. So, you know, Naveen, the one that stood out to you certainly is what the audience also believes. It doesn't get at the underlying problem is the biggest barrier. That's where the sort of biggest pause for thought. But, you know, also that signal that, you know, perhaps this is sending a message that, you know, we don't choose women for their talent. You know, they cause them to doubt themselves, and then that has all sorts of other negative implications. Only a very small number of people said no real barriers. So, you know, we know obviously that there are some things that get in our way. All right, well, thanks for sharing that. Let's, you know, I also just want to move to the next poll. So let's pop that one up, Helen, and then we can get into the real conversation. So what do we think the benefits of quotas are? You know, of these sort of options here, puts an end to the old boys network. You know, we know that the majority of leaders are men, so, you know, they have their own network. You know, puts an end to that, accelerates the process of gender equality, so gets us where we want to be faster, ensures that organizations invest more in the development of their women. You know, got to meet the quota, so got to make sure they're ready, so much more investment there. Creates great role models for women in more junior positions. You know, you look up, who can I aspire to be? That's important for younger people. Ensures that there are a broader set of selection criteria used to select leaders. You know, we're not just narrowly focused on people we already have. We need to broaden our criteria, or frankly, no benefits to this. So which of these, I mean, Veronica, which of these stand out for you as sort of as a leading benefit, would you say?
Well, I would say almost all of them, bar the last one. I mean, because you know, it's coming down again to the point that we've all emphasised as panellists. It's about a talent pool. I mean, I can't, as a chair of a nominations committee for a board, I cannot emphasise enough. You get loads of men that aren't suitable for boards. I know it's a shock, guys. Absolutely shocking, but some of you really aren't good enough for boards, okay? So it is just this funnel issue. If you actually invest in the development of women, if you have role models, as that poll is saying, all of this will, in the end, create a bigger talent pool of women coming to the top. And going back to my 5 daughters, I mean, I do wonder whether there is a generational piece here as well. And we may get better results. I very much feel that it's been my generation that had to kind of pioneer and push and battle through this. And I am hopeful that actually, because there is a generational shift in the mindsets of men as well, and my sons-in-law are very, very different from a lot of the men that were in my generation, you know, that this may eventually pass. So I am hopeful, but everything we can do to create a bigger talent pool. And we know it's a problem, because I will tell you, you can look at these things you'll look at the, particularly in the science and engineering in universities, we are at a point where we're taking equal numbers of men and women in at that point, initial point of the first faculty position. And then it's still tailing off as you try to get up to the full chair positions. So it's the stuff that happens in the middle, Lewis, that is the problem.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you know, there's something systemic about it. And it's interesting, you know, in the poll here, you can see that what the audience believes is the sort of biggest benefit is that it then starts to redirect more attention to the importance of, you know, developing and maintaining the careers of women as, you know, they reach that critical middle component, right? You know, you see that glass ceiling, and it's not that the opportunities aren't there, but life starts to change. And it's really interesting, Veronica, one of the things you've really brought into this conversation is life outside of work. We started talking about your family, and, you know, it's no longer acceptable really to say, well, you know, you perform at work and then you go home and you have a separate life outside of work, and then you know, go back to work the next day. That's just not true anymore. No. And, you know, there's a recognition, I think, now for all of us that, well, you know, I really like your point about, you know, recognizing you can't do everything at once. So we need to restructure the way that careers work to make it work for more people.
Lewis, can I just add something to that?
Sure.
Because when I came into the workforce, very often you were encouraged as a woman to hide the fact that you'd had maternity leaves or how many children you had. And one of the things I believe is that a lot of the stuff that happened to me outside of work, and we've all talked about our personal lives, actually gave me leadership development in a way that work couldn't. So this idea that actually a complex home life doesn't actually feed into your leadership ability, I think is really wrong. I think women that have to hold, and I don't want to go into what happened with me, but I ended up having to take an enormous leadership position within an even bigger family than 5 daughters, and I don't want to go into why. But actually that gave me a confidence that actually I could do some leadership positions at work. And so I think you're absolutely right, Lewis, this of trying to understand your wholeness as a person and your whole potential and your whole experience, and bring that to bear on saying, I can be a leader.
Right, wonderful. So we've got some really good questions coming through. I'm just going to start picking some for us to start a debate. Naveen, I'm going to come to you. And this is going to be in no particular order because there's so many great questions, but just what catches my eye. So, but I think it's kind of stays with this topic about gender roles and, you know, how families have changed a little bit. So someone's asking, do you think quotas should also be applicable for men? So for example, in industries that are dominated by women, should we have a male quota? You know, would you like to see certain industries, because, you know, I guess if you've got a quota for women, that by definition, you've already maybe created one for men. What's your perspective on this idea?
Look, I believe in the power of diversity. Let's put it that way. And I believe in having multiple voices at the table, whether that is, and one aspect of diversity is gender equality, so men and women. But I believe in diversity of any form of diversity. It could be even thought, diversity of thought, diversity of ethnic background. You know, there's all kinds of, like, even ideological diversities can be very, very powerful. Like if you grow up in a very different environment ideologically to, say, a colleague of yours, that can be very powerful if you can tap into and make that person feel included in the conversation so that their ideology can come into the conversation. That can be very powerful. So I guess the answer to that would be yes, I think so. I think we should do that. I'm thinking of some industries. I'm back from my consulting. I remember doing some work in the fashion industry, and there was, you know, definitely very female dominated in the fashion industry, especially amongst the designers and amongst, you know, the creatives. I think the creative industry of advertising is also very heavily dominated by one gender. So I think it was women. I think it is mostly women in the advertising industry as well. But look, I don't know. I'm not saying that.
Yeah, no, I mean, so look, I've just sprung it
Yeah.
on you, and I know there's obviously no right answer to this. I mean, and I think you said already that the quotas are an imperfect tool, right? Like, you know, you're kind of forcing a change because you need to have a target to go to, and you need to, you know, as you say, you know, create some acceleration. But, and you know, just to talk it out with you, my concern would be that you create like a culture of quotas. And like, you know, where that's the only way to fix something, when really, you know, they're a kind of a methodology for fixing a problem that's become too big for the system itself.
Yeah, and I think probably the way I would like to answer that question is maybe not so much about yes or no, but men versus women. I would like to think if you were a CEO or the chief executive or on the board of a company, you know, you might be self-aware enough. We should be holding our leaders accountable to be self-aware and critical about their business, their government, their institution, and to be, you know, honest with themselves and say when they can see group thinking happening. You know, the biggest curse is when you start to sort of believe all of your own nonsense, right, in a way. And this is what happens when you don't have diverse institutions and you don't have that. So if it happens to be very male dominated, it may not be a gender issue, it could be some other issue. But I generally feel that this group thinking, and it happens a lot in the technology industry, to be honest, right? There's a lot of belief that we are in our own echo chambers, you know, it's like people, you sort of lose touch with reality. And that's why diversity is so powerful, because you suddenly have a contrarian view at the table and you're like, oh my God, I never thought about that. Okay, and that's where I think it gets dangerous, when you have this group think.
Yeah, yeah, super interesting.
I tend to agree. Yeah, I tend to agree with Naveen that, you know, even when we say we want to set a quota, I think you set a quota, or setting quota is just one of the many ways of having more diversity and inclusivity into the organization. So you set a quota with your eyes open. So you don't just 50-50, that's the right number to go, right? So I think the very fact that if you start to detect group thinking, that everybody is, you know, nobody disagrees and everybody agrees with you, then, you know, something is not right. So for example, when I first joined the public service, and I went for a group meeting, and everybody, you know, were promoted from within the public service, and they're all directors. And when I went in, and at a point in time, I was talking to the permanent secretary, doing some presentation, and I addressed him by his name, and I see 25 pairs of eyes looking at me. Oh, she addressed the perm sec by his name instead of his title. So it depends on, you know, and the culture that you bring in, the diverse views that you bring in, and sometimes people find that quite refreshing, and that you bring in a different perspective which they don't otherwise have.
Absolutely.
So as we set quota, we have to be careful. What are we gunning for? What are we trying to achieve? And not just blindly setting a quota.
Yeah. So, and this is an important question, which is that, you know, there is some, I think, conversation about how long would a quota be needed for? Like, you know, if you wanted to drive that kind of short-term change, how would you get rid of it once it was sort of implemented? Do you have any examples of other quotas that have kind of been brought in and then sunset? I mean, I don't know if we've been through that process before, right? Oh, we have, Veronica.
Well, I'm sorry, you have to look at the issue of South Africa post-apartheid, where quotas were brought in.
Yeah.
And, you know, let's all be aware, quotas were brought into the South African rugby team with great success in terms of the World Cup.
It's a wonderful example, yeah.
And, you know, I mean, that was a situation where undoubtedly, if they had not forced change very, very fast, the implications for that society post-apartheid were extreme. So we have got examples of where quotas have not necessarily lasted to the same extent in that society, but they were absolutely pushed in. And I worked in South Africa post-apartheid, and whatever racial group you came from, there was some resentment from the privileged white population, of course there was, but they did realize that this needed to happen fast in order for them to get some equality of opportunity really visible in that society. So we've got examples of very rapidly being brought in, and with some success.
Right. I mean, and on that topic, because you know, we're starting to sort of bend towards then, you know, political events. I think there's a really good question here around current megatrends. It's a very consultancy word, isn't it? Basically stuff that's happening, and we see rising nationalism and populism, you know, much more sort of in-group focus, more isolationist type behavior and policy. And in fact, I think for many of us, the pandemic has highlighted inequalities in society in a way that has just been so stark. And in our preparation conversation, we talked about, for example, you know, work from home has become women work and, you know, give care, men work. And so, you know, it's also again highlighted the inequalities as we brought work into home. And so, you know, the question really is, so how do we all work together on this? You know, how do we get more organized so that companies, governments, other society groups and individuals can all start to contribute to progress in a far more productive way? Because I do agree that, and I think we can all see this, that the current, I think men increasingly are saying we want to be part of this, and there is now a bigger conversation about, so how do we make sure that happens in a way that's constructive, and, you know, that maybe even goes against some of the other trends that we're seeing, which are sort of creating more inequality. So what can we actually do to be better organized and better coordinated? That's a big question. I appreciate that's like a, please solve world hunger.
Okay, maybe I'll start, and then and I don't claim to know the answer, but I think what a big factor in getting started is education. I think that's probably, to me, the biggest thing that an organization can do is to continue to educate, and the education could be formal, as in it could be through organized, you know, classes, training, you know, enablement sessions, you know, and where you bring in, you know, your own internal instructors to have a conversation about it, or it could be external as well, externally facilitated. But it could also be informal. Like it could, you know, you could ensure there are enough conversations that are happening throughout the company or the institution that are productive in that sense. And I mean, just speaking from my own experience at Cisco, we have a conversation pretty much on the topic every week with all of our team. We have about 35,000 people that connect every week in something called the Cisco Beat. It was called the Cisco Beat, but it's now called the Cisco Check-In. Happens every I think Thursday night. And you know, Chuck Robbins, our CEO, basically gets on a call with about 35,000 employees, and we have a conversation about it. You know, and it's incredible to have these kind of powerful conversations online and with this level of engagement, because you know, if you start to see these informal conversations happening, then it becomes more part of everyday life. And so I think it's important to have a balance between organized training and education, and also informal conversations. I think that would help in organization, I think, personally.
That's very practical, wonderful example. I love that education. I mean, I do want to explore that topic, because somebody has left in the Q&A, you know, earlier on in the session, actually saying that people hate D&I training. It backfires, you know, they end up resenting it. So I think we have to talk about what kind of education, you know, works, but let's come back to that. Peck and Veronica, anything to kind of add on this? You know, education is one area. Agree, disagree?
Okay, so just a few thoughts here. One is, with all the minority groups, I've been doing this research with board directors during COVID, Lewis. And one of the things we've had to look at is this issue of social equalities during COVID, because it's been so huge for business and society. And I think one of the things that has struck me is that if you actually want to see change, what the board and the senior team need to do is go to the leadership of those networks. Most big employers have women's networks. They will have other forms of networks. And instead of the board trying to think up the solutions from their perspective, it's really, really important to go and understand from the leadership of the minority networks what is actually going on for them and what they need. I think the big danger is that because we're senior managers and we're on boards, we think we've got the answers. We haven't got the answers. If we got the answers, we wouldn't have the problem. I think it's actually going out and listening to what, say, my daughters need of their generation. What do they need? What do they want? And not trying to solve this from our perspective. Those who are included cannot speak on behalf of those that are excluded because they don't understand the experience. And that, for me, would be one of the big learning points to take away from this. Yeah. If you are bothered about this, and if you're a male, go and make sure that those networks that will exist in your organisation, go and talk to them. Don't make assumptions based on your own experience. That would be my big advice.
And you know, it's interesting, isn't it, Veronica, because you know, the internet, it's one of these things that has provided everybody with a voice. And actually what you see, I actually am suspicious, because I think social media is one of the reasons all of a sudden everyone cares about this, because it's like, well, the volume of people you can get mobilized on, you know, from all over the place to sort of, let's say, boycott something or to express dissatisfaction is so much more than it used to be. It's in the information, the power has moved. And you notice much more reputation sensitivity from organizations these days, you know, frankly, because they're so transparent. You know, you just can't get away with doing whatever you want. And I feel that that's perhaps, you know, there are downsides to social media for sure. You know, it's very polarizing, and, you know, for all the good in terms of sharing experiences that you get all of the crazy racists like, oh, wow, because it gives them a voice too. So, you know, it's incredible to see, you know, how that technology is changing this conversation and enabling many more people to be heard.
Absolutely. Yeah.
What's your view on this then, in terms of ways that we can better work together across various different segments of society?
I absolutely agree with Veronica, and very often I'm trained as a coach, and very often when I coach like high potential women, for example, it may be the Asian culture as well. We try to be everything to everybody, and then we forget to take care of ourselves. And I've spoken to many women who are on the verge of, and successful women who are on the verge of burnout, because they try to be the best mom, they try to be the best wife, the best daughter, the best leader in their organization, the best colleague, and the best subordinate, meets all their KPIs. And when they are given more load, you know, they just take it on, because otherwise I may be seen as, you know, I'm not coping. I may be seen as, you know, people are judging me that because I have, in Veronica's case, 5 daughters, you're not able to do your balance well and all that. And we just take on so much load. And I mean, okay, half an hour before this, I was preparing dinner. How many of you were preparing dinner? Or how many guys are preparing dinner? Just, you know, and we kind of take it upon ourselves. So I think very often it is bringing to awareness that, you know, we are human. You're a woman, but you're not superwoman. Same as the guys and men are not supermen. And quite often, because of our, I don't know, maternal instincts, we tend to want to take care of other people, of those we love, more than we take care of ourselves. So very often I have to remind the woman whom I coach, please love yourself a bit more. Please do exercise, self-care. And like everybody else, you only have 24 hours. And if it is something that you're really passionate about, something that you want to drive at, go for it.
Yep.
Okay, never mind what people judge you and all, just go for it. If you want the job, go ask for the job, which is what I did. Okay.
Oh, I believe you. So, I mean, this interesting, just because I want to stay with you just a minute, because, you know, one of the panelists has a wonderful question, because you expressed that you don't think the quotas are very fair, because, you know, look, you know, it's for all the reasons we've above, you know, it's sending the wrong signals, not addressing underlying problem, etc. And so someone's asked a fair question, which is, so how do we achieve this gender equality, boost that pipeline, etc.? If we don't use quotas, what do you feel is the right way to do that? In a way, and, you know, appreciating that, of course, time is important. You know, we could spend forever working on this, which would be a waste of everyone's time and energy. So why quotas may be a bit of a simple solution, but what do you really believe makes a difference based on your experience?
And I think it's giving the fair opportunities, and it's, again, like I said, it's a matter of balancing. And quota is not I didn't say quota is bad. I just say that, you know, I don't think it is the only tool. It may not be the most effective tool in the long term. It may not, you know, help us achieve what we are trying to do for all the reasons that you stated, okay? For all the wrong reasons why people are going to hire women into their boards or into senior leadership position. But I think once we are clear of what is it we are trying to achieve and what kind of diversity we are trying to arrive at, then I think setting the quota for the short term in order to bring us to that position, that may not be a bad idea. So for example, for board representation, Singapore is pathetically low, okay? And we say that, you know, well, the government doesn't like to legislate, but it's like foreign workers quota. If you legislate, you know, people have no choice but to comply to it. And similarly for hiring for people who are physically challenged, for example. In some countries, they basically set a quota. If you don't meet that quota, you get penalized quite heavily. So it helps to give people the added nudge and the added incentive to steer towards what we are trying to achieve. But once you get there, then you can, you know, ease your foot off the pedal.
Fair enough. So then, you know, just as we get to the end of our time here, I wondered if any of you can share sort of good things that you see happening that are helping us move forward. And then we'll do one more little poll before the end. You know, what do you consider to be the gold standard? I mean, Naveen, you already shared, you know, it's an ongoing conversation about education, but where's it going well? So Peck, you know, maybe just start with you. What do you think is really working and helping us make progress right now?
I think, you know, giving people the fair opportunities and like I said, you know, if you want to set some level of, set some clear goals of what we're trying to achieve, and then you make sure that the process of going about doing it, for example, instead of just quota, you make sure that your interview selection panel is actually the right composition. And having role models and having that evidence and that data to show the benefits of having a diverse board of diverse leadership and how it helps with the bottom line of the organization.
Good. More data. Good answer.
More
Like
data.
that answer. Naveen, over to you. What do you think?
Yeah, so for me, I feel like in terms of attracting women into the organization, you have to look at it across all levels, like I was saying earlier. So in terms of attracting women into the organization, certainly a diverse panel makes a lot of sense. But also I think that it's important to recruit for capabilities and skills as opposed to other factors that drive, exclusionary practices, like, for example, universities or networks or wherever that, that you've gone to. I generally don't, I came from the consulting industry where we used to hire very heavily from top tier business schools. I don't believe in that anymore. Like, I've just changed completely in the last 3 years. I think that we should, like, I've come across so many diverse people in Cisco that don't have an education, but they have an incredible capability to try to support the organization. So I think we have to be careful around how we select and screen, and therefore, and gender is a factor in that. So let's try to have diverse panels. Secondly, I think as we start to bring more women in through the ranks of the organization, I'm a big believer in sponsorship as opposed to mentorship. Although I believe there's a merit in mentoring women through an organization, but I feel that sponsorship plays a bigger role, particularly in organizations that have, a gender imbalance. So when you are, say, in an organization that's 80% men and 20% women, it's quite natural to talk about the men on your team and how great they are. But I think it's quite important to realize that you need to spend a disproportionate amount of time speaking about the incredible women on your team and having authentic conversations, over Zoom or over WebEx or over in the coffee room or wherever it is, but speaking authentically and sponsoring the women that you've come across as well, and making an active choice to actually promote a woman in a conversation. And that helps because, I think men generally will take referrals from other people, whether it's a man or a woman. And so if you hear consistently, oh, this woman's amazing, she's done great work, she's done great work, she's done great work, you'll be like, okay, I need her on my team. And then, you sort of bring them into the team. And that's kind of, hopefully will bring women through the ranks and give them opportunity, which is what Peck was saying.
More sponsorship. Naveen, I'm sorry, I'm just going to, because we're running real short on time. I'd love to hear from you, my friend. I really would. Yeah. Veronica, just...
Okay. 2 points.
Yes.
2 points. Okay.
On the poll.
One is that you need a more diverse set of women role models. So there are some women that got to the top by pretending to be men. All right. And that is not attractive for loads and loads of women. So I have never wanted to be a man, and I don't want to mimic one. And I think you need to get a very broad range of role models. And the second thing is an exhortation to all you men. So when you see wherever in an organization or in a meeting, mansplaining going on, men talking over women, women being derided for their contribution, instead of expecting the woman to speak up, men should be speaking up for women. And that is what I do not see, is actually the men going out on the limb going, actually, I think the way that you are treating Nadine or whatever is not right. And that I think will give women a sense of confidence and that there is a solidarity with men around them.
So we're just gonna, that's wonderful, Veronica. And, it's interesting. I think what's that quote, your culture is defined by the lowest form of behavior willing to accept, and it's like, I think it's really true. It's like if you see bad behavior and no one calls it out, then it's endorsed. And so, yes, really good point. So we wonder if anybody's changed their mind. So we're going to run the poll one last time. It's up here in front of you. Do you have a different perspective? I mean, just in the last minute here, I think we've heard some really interesting views, shared from a really fantastic and experienced panel. We have seen the incredible performance, really, of women in leadership positions, in spite of all the challenges through the COVID, particularly highlighted by the COVID-19 crisis. And I think one of the things that starts to sort of question is, well, why do we need quotas when, you know, we clearly have a signal that we have these tremendously talented women who we've been able to find and promote into these positions? But that's just the point. They're so rare that that, you know, there's still a hell of a lot more work to be done. And I think what we're seeing, oh yeah, see, we did change people's minds. I don't know if this is selection bias, because, you know, we have a slightly smaller audience perhaps than, you know, some folks have dropped off now, but I consider that to be a success for those of us who are, you know, championing this. So very interesting to see that. Obviously some arguments that swayed people, but look, last point, that leadership is a resource for group success. If any of you who were at the International Women's Day presentation that I gave last year, one of the points that I was making was that actually leadership it's not a privileged position. It's in fact just the opposite. It's a resource for the collective success of the group. And we should therefore, we all have a responsibility to find the best possible leaders we can and move them into those positions. And there's a lot of evidence and a lot of data that tells us that women aren't just as good as men at this. In fact, they have the potential to be even better. We just need them to have more courage to take on those positions, because frankly, as we've kind of learned in this conversation, very often they've never done that job before. They've never been asked to do it before. And so they just need the nudge in the right direction. So I think there's a lot that can be achieved if an official nudge in the form of a quota can help move us in a more productive and faster fashion towards that objective. So with that, I want to thank you, wonderful panelists. You were really insightful. Peck, Naveen, Veronica, you really were tremendous. Really appreciate all of your time, your energy and your comments. And I think, Helen, we're bang on, well, we're 2 minutes past 6. So we'll let everyone drop off, but thank you to all the attendees for fantastic questions. Sorry we couldn't get to them all, but I hope you got all that out of this session today. And with that, I think, Helen, back to you and we can close up. Oh, David. Thank you, David. Sorry.
Thank you so much indeed, Lewis. That was absolutely fantastic. And thanks again to our speakers, Peck, Naveen, Veronica. Really, really great session today. And thank you to you, our guests, as well. I sincerely hope that you've enjoyed our International Women's Day virtual conference that has sparked thought and debate. And I hope that there are some key takeaways and learnings from this session and the other previous sessions as well. I've certainly learned a lot over the last 10 days and have found every one of the sessions really inspiring. So I hope you have too. The Chamber has a really packed calendar of events and webinars, so please do keep a lookout for those, and please do get in touch with myself or the team if anybody's interested in becoming a member of the Chamber too. Once again, a thank you to our diversity inclusion partners, Barclays Bank, for your continued support of the Chamber and this important agenda. A really, really brilliant week, so thank you so much to all of you. Just finally, you'll receive a feedback form from Helen. This gives us a great opportunity to learn and continue to bring you interesting and relevant content. So please do fill that in. Your opinions are very much appreciated in helping us to do this. And so that leaves me to say a final thank you to all of you, and I very much look forward to seeing you all soon. Take care.